Welcome. I don't know about you. First of all, I love that opening, but the middle makes me want to start marching somewhere. I don't know where. And then at the end, it makes me feel like there's something very suspenseful about to happen. And so I don't think it's suspenseful, but something is about to happen, and that is we're going to be talking about First Ladies today. So welcome to all of you here at the Miller Center in person, and welcome to those who are joining us online. We are not only going to be talking about First Ladies, but certainly the history of the office of First Lady and why we should study them and what kinds of influence they've had over them. So I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to each. To my left here, down at the end of the row, is Terry, and she is a journalism professor at the University of Kansas. And so I have learned, sister-in-law, who's a KU alum, to say, "Rock, chalk, Jayhawk," and I will not chant it, but I could if you asked me to, and is an expert, Terry is, on journalism, does oral histories in journalism, but now has written, as you will see next to her right, a companion book, it's called, for Cambridge University Press on First Lady. But it's a thematic approach to First Lady. So each chapter, instead of just doing Martha Washington to Melania Trump, will encompass several First Ladies on a theme that was chosen by Lisa and Terry. And I was very honored to be chosen to do the chapter on First Ladies, how we remember them, how we memorialize them, what is the public memory of them. So it was really an honor to work with Terry and Lisa. And I've also done not an oral history as such, but podcasts that they do on First Ladies. Be sure to look for that as well. And thank you to Terry for being here, because she's been traveling all over the country, as has Heath, who is to my immediate left here, because her new book is out called The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, about Pat Nixon. And so she's just come to California from Sunnylands, the Annenberg estate, Palm Springs, and she gave a presentation and also did research there on the Nixons. And I was able to tell her that Sunnylands, the Annenberg estate, is where Frank Sinatra married his last wife, Barbara Marx, who was married to Seppo, one of the Marx brothers. So highly recommend, if you're looking for Hollywood gossip and interesting stories, that's the one to look at. In the meantime, please read about Mrs. Nixon. And in the middle here today is Michael LaRosa. And Michael, I got to know a little bit when he was the press secretary for Dr. Jill Biden. He was First Lady in the first 2 years of her First Ladyship, but also he was their Biden spokesperson during the 2020. So we want to talk to him today about what that's like to be in a campaign and then find yourself in the East Wing working for the First Lady. So with that, I am going to begin with a question for Terry, because she has, I think, the most expansive understanding of all of us here today about the office and its history. So tell us, Terry, given the fact that First Ladyship, the office of First Lady, is not a formal office in the sense that it's not in the Constitution, it's not in any statute or law, and yet we pay so much attention to First Ladies. And why is that? And tell us about their influence and why we should study them and why people should be getting your book after we meet today. It makes either a late Mother's Day gift or an early holiday present. So with that, please tell us.
Well, one of the things that's interesting to me is, as I'm sure you're all aware, we're going to be celebrating America 250 next year. So we've had not quite 250, but almost 250 years of First Ladies. And yet scholars haven't really studied First Ladies in depth. It was really in the mid-1980s. So we kind of have 200 years to catch up on at this point, right? And so we just have this huge swath of history. And as our book outlines, there's so many ways that they intersect with history. So we have a chapter examining their influence in war, their influence in social causes. Obviously, their influence in fashion is talked about. And one of the reasons that I like to study First Ladies' history is because women's history is so forgotten. Hence why First Ladies weren't studied until the 1980s. And so we can learn a lot about expectations of gender in any particular era. by how the first ladies were reacted to in the media. That's what I specifically look into. And what that tells us about American culture norms, gender norms, their pop culture figures. And really, when I'm talking to younger audiences, because I'm a professor, so I teach 20-year-olds all the time, these were really the original influencers. These were women who had power in this country when many women didn't. And so I think analyzing their impact on our country is just as interesting as studying the presidency.
Why do you think that is that, for example, presidency scholars, and I happen to be a trained political scientist and studied both the presidency and the courts, as it turned out, here at UVA. But why do you think that presidency scholars have been sort of late to the game, if ever they want to join in the game?
Oh, can I speak freely as I tend to?
You're among friends here. It's only being recorded for all of history.
That's
Please.
the thing I got to think. Well, for one, history is predominated by men, and men write about men. You can see this in how Mary Todd Lincoln has been treated throughout history, and how male biographers treat her very differently than women who tend to have more sympathy for her. It matters who writes history, and having women's perspectives in who writes history. It makes a big difference.
So another thing that I understand, having come out with my PhD in the 1980s from UVA, was that when I would go out for interviews, and Betsy here knew my mentor, Henry Abraham, and because he was my mentor, I got lots of interviews. And sometimes people would say, we just want to see who this person is who was written about in this letter so elegantly by this mentor. So thanks to him. But I would go to these political science departments, and they would begin by saying, well, of course you'll want to teach our women in politics class. And the fact of the matter was, I hadn't studied women in politics because there were no women in politics classes. There were hardly women in politics, for that matter, at the highest level. So I did not want to be pigeonholed such as that. And so only after I had been teaching for about 15 years at Sweetbriar College down the road, which is still an all-women's college, did I think, oh, you know what it would be fun to do is teach a course called Women in Politics Law. And I loved it, and the students loved it, and the student who loved it the most was Afghan, who had come to Sweetbriar to be paid for 4 years to get a degree, and her job in life, she thought, was someday to go back to Afghanistan and help women get the kinds of rights that in this country. So I take your point, certainly. Let's talk a little bit, anybody can jump in at this point, but let's talk a little bit about the roles. You talked about how people view first ladies, how media have viewed them as pop culture figures. But let's talk about maybe specifically Pat Nixon and how she fulfilled in her mind, and as we look back in history, her role. And then let's go to Michael, because
I can respond to all of this.
Good, excellent,
Tell you
excellent.
the practical part of it.
Exactly, the practical part of it, and what you saw Mrs. Biden, Dr. Biden, doing in performing the role of First Lady most. But let me start with we'll go back a little bit in history to Mrs.
Sure. Well, Pat Nixon is such an interesting First Lady, and the title of the book, of course, is The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, because I think a lot of people, when I first started working on it, said, I didn't know her. I don't know much about her, or what they told me was plastic Pat, or she had an alcohol problem. None of these are true. The book is really a deconstruction of that, and the media had made her so based on a lot of incorrect things. And this happens to all First Ladies. I think it's very unfortunate and very sexist. First Ladies are always reduced to tropes, to something easy. So plastic Pat, in Jill Biden's case, Lady Macbeth, I wrote a whole op-ed about this. It's totally unfair, reductive, and not true. Generally, these things are untrue, but they're easy for the public to grasp and say the media pushes them out. It's also a way to get to their husbands. Of course, a way to attack them is through the wife, the children, very common since ancient times. You know, this happens. Thomas Jefferson, I remember this happened. to him as well. So Mrs. Nixon, of course, I think we don't know as well because of Watergate also. This kind of wipes her out. It's almost like her legacy is erased because she goes out on that tide when her husband is disgraced. So,
And she's seen that day. I'll never forget her stand there on stage as Nixon gave his farewell, which I also think is the most human that Richard Nixon ever seemed in public.
Yes.
He is weepy.
Yes.
He talks about his mother and
Yes,
says, no
Hannah.
one will ever write a book about my mother but me. And a colleague of mine pointed out that that was the year that Rose Kennedy's memoir came out, and that he always was comparing himself and contrasting himself with the Kennedys. So to say, my mother will never have a book written about her, but to see Pat Nixon and the two daughters with tears in their eyes. And so she was, I think, viewed from that point on then as this tragic figure.
she was.
And one of my, raise your hand in the audience, that one of my colleagues said to me today, why don't we know any more about Pat Nixon? And I said, Keith will tell us. Why do we not know any more about Pat Nixon?
Yes.
Thankfully, now we do.
Yes, and I'll hopefully tell you later about all the many amazing things that she did. All the first. She was an amazing, accomplished First Lady. She did so much, but because of Watergate, because of the West Wing guys, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, the Germans, tamping down her publicity. We can talk about that for a long time, too. And also because Mrs. Nixon was shy, a private person who was very warm one-on-one, but she didn't want the attention. She didn't seek the spotlight. And remember, women of that era, you really didn't want your name in the papers except maybe at birth, when you married, and death. I mean, we were told not to do that. So she's going against all that, and also the pioneer days of the East Wing, when the East Wing is just being built. And our next panelist can tell us a lot more about the East Wing and how that operates. But in the 70s, this is new territory. There was not much of a roadmap for a First Lady as a press operation, as a marketing operation. So,
Well, I will want to know what Michael has to say about that from personal experience in his situation. To say, I'm thinking about how many of you have ever watched the Checkers, the famous Nixon Checkers speech? And if you have, you will note that Pat was there
Yes.
in the studio, and
Yes.
occasionally the camera would turn to her, and particularly when Nixon famously talked about that his wife did not have a fancy coat, she had a regular cloth Republican
Republican coat.
because the
Yes.
Checker speech was to work back at the theme and the story that he had a slush fund
Right.
that he was using. So imagine that this is 1952, right, when
Yeah.
he's the vice presidential nominee for Eisenhower. And in 1952, only about 20% of Americans had television, their households. So her first exposure really to television is to be used as a prop in a very uncomfortable situation. So maybe that's part of why she tended to be shy and wanted not to have so much in the way of publicity. Tell us about what it really is like in the East Wing.
Yeah, Jill, Dr. Biden used to, we as staff would get very protective about the use, when the West Wing would keep her as a surrogate or want her to join him at certain speeches or on certain trips. Like, what is her role? Because she's not going to be a prop. That's like what we used to. That word reminded me of my days, or PTSD, I guess, from those days. But and just hearing, first of all, I just want to say, being with historians now is so important, especially talking about First Ladies, because as we are seeing in this present moment, history is being written about the Biden, and the role of the spouse, the role of the First Lady, I think it will be under not scrutiny, but I think it will be exposed as having like a greater role than people think, an influential role. And I think that what's so unique about it is that there are no rules to being First Lady, and everybody's experience is different with different First Ladies, but and that's what Jill used to say on the speech on the stump, that I'm going to use it in my way. She didn't want to be an icon or dancing on Ellen like Mrs. Obama, and she didn't want to be, a fashion icon either. And that used to, that was also a sensitive spot. And I didn't, while it's ironically, I started my journey as an intern for a former First Lady, Hillary Clinton, and ended my time in public life, public government with a First Lady. But the fashion stuff was a sensitive topic because we always felt like she was doing and saying more to influence either young people or the public, or to help them get to know her husband, that was just beyond her fashion. And so we would always respond by saying to a reporter, well, did you ask the boy's side what he's wearing first? And usually the answer was no. And then, we wouldn't really discuss it. In major moments, whether when she was wearing something for a state dinner, or for the inauguration, or I remember one of the State of the Unions when she was sitting with our ambassador, or I'm sorry, the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States. She had, I have to recall this correctly, I think she had dandelions either patched onto her dress that night that you could see to sort of demonstrate support for the Ukrainians. And there were reporters who did want to, with genuinely journalistic intentions, want to write about how fashion can send messages. They do. Dr. Biden wasn't always very strategic about that, because that's just not her way of thinking and approaching things. But that's sort of how I feel about the influencer part. She that First Lady, the one that I worked for, didn't seek out to be an influencer. And the part that is actually influencing, part of her legacy, hopefully, will be that she is the First Lady to keep her day job. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't something that was orchestrated. It was just something, there was no hesitation. She was just going to do it because she did it as Second Lady. And the only problem was making sure we could find a way to keep her safe and keep the integrity of her classroom. And there was never an interview or never a camera or a reporter allowed inside her classroom the entire time she was First Lady or Second Lady.
Would you get those requests
all
from
the time? All the time. And her students were, as she would say, very nonplussed with who she was. I mean, most of them, I think, when she became First Lady, I think when they were walking through the metal detectors, understood that this was going to be but it was a core elective, or a core requirement at that community college to teach English. So you weren't choosing, based on like a political interest. Like, you had to take English, and if you got stuck with Dr. B, you didn't really know until it was in your face, until the magnetometer was in your face. But yes, there was we talked about one of the First Ladies being attacked, or how people can attack the First Lady as a way to get to their husband. And that's the tricky part, because, as I learned very quickly, they're a supporting actor in this whole thing. And the family, especially now, families are weaponized more than Jill and Dr. Biden and President Biden were ever used to, because there was so much civility while they were raising their family, not in Washington, but around his career in politics, that they just weren't used to children or in-laws or siblings being fair game. But that was a big part of their legacy too, is that their family was weaponized for politics.
You said, Michael, as we were talking about why First Ladies haven't been in the academic world studying, you said, I have something to say about that. Can I circle back to you about your thoughts on how the academic world, from a practitioner's point of view, should study? What should we, as professors and biographers, be studying about First Ladies as we look back at them?
Well, I think this is what I was thinking when that came up, but taking it back to the present time, I think unfortunately, and I'm sure she's going to see this, but you know, her actions, her motivations. I'm speaking about the one that I work for, Dr. Biden. Everything about her will be examined going forward for history, and in this, as we grapple as the Democratic Party, but also as a country with the history which is being written right now and exposed right now about the unprecedented moment of last summer, which you don't see very often. I don't know if we've ever seen it. Maybe LBJ was the last time the president had voluntarily given up power. Nixon was sort of forced by a few members of the Congress who went down there. And ironically, that was very similar to what took place last summer. It was like Nixon, different circumstances, but it took members of the president's own party to really influence his decision to step aside. It came very late in the process, and Dr. B's role is going to be examined by historians. And the key, I think, is because First Ladies, there are no rules, there are these hidden powers that they have. And I think history is going to start taking that more seriously as a result of sort of what took place last summer.
Well, no doubt we'll come back to that, and I'm sure folks in the room, and by the way, if you have questions as we go along, or you came in with questions, be sure to write them down on the little card in your seat, and my colleague Alfred Reeves IV will come and pick them up if you just hold them up. And then if you're online, I think, is it, Alfred, is the Q&A function? Yeah, Q&A function if you're joining us online, and those will be passed on to me as well. So we'll leave about 10 minutes or so for questions. Let me go to Terry, since we've been talking about more recent First Ladies. And Terry tells me, in addition to traveling all over the country about her book, that she said, I just raced into Charlottesville from Montpelier. I said, oh, you wanted to go see Dolly's Digs at Montpelier, didn't you? Yes, the Madison's home. And I said, good for you, because I think you get a real sense of Dolly Madison at Montpelier. But if we can flash back to the founding period and talk about maybe even the First Lady of Martha Washington, but I'll let you run with that, with whatever early First Ladies you'd like to talk about, and what you've learned in doing your book on them, but also what did you learn today at Montpelier about Dolly Madison?
Well, I mean, I don't know that I learned anything I didn't know before, but I know that we were going to have a discussion about soft power and what, how First Ladies yield soft power and what that's about. And it was interesting when the tour guide mentioned today that Madison had a saying that Dolly got more done at her dinners than I got done in my office, right? Which tells you the power of a First Lady and how important hostessing is in establishing relationships, which therefore gets hard power done. So I thought that was an interesting thing. And then, you know, when we talk about the merging of soft and hard power, I saw a book in the gift shop about how the Madisons were the original power couple. When I think of original power couple, I also think of James and Sarah Polk, because Sarah Polk was really a co-president, and most people don't know that. She was from a very politically inclined family. Andrew Jackson was going through her home. I mean, she wanted political power and married somebody who would help make that happen. She was very involved with James and keeping track of his media coverage and helping him with speeches. And, you know, a lot of people don't know about these early First Ladies, which I think is really unfortunate. And so in my work, I focus specifically on the forgotten First Ladies like Sarah and Grace Coolidge. She is more recent, Mamie Eisenhower, so she's not totally forgotten. But I'm currently working on a Mamie Eisenhower project. The Eisenhower Museum was renovated about 5 years ago. Come out to Kansas. This is an amazing museum. And the project that I'm working on is we tend to think of Mamie's collective memory as the woman who loved pink. She was just a housewife, right? She has this dowdy kind of framing. But when you go to the Eisenhower Museum, they have completely reinvented her memory. The very first thing you learn about her is that this was a partnership. They were an ambitious couple. So not just Ike was ambitious, but Mamie was ambitious too. It talks about our career. There's quotes from her about how I bought in early on this idea of partnership. Ike has made comments that he wouldn't have been Ike without Mamie, which I think is interesting when we think about power, how many of these women made the presidency possible. So I'm interested in studying those kinds of things. When we think about the early first ladies too, my chapter in the book in particular focuses on first ladies and mourning. We automatically think of Jackie Kennedy when we think of presidential mourning, right? Because that's so seared into so many people's minds because they lived through it. But what I found is that Crete Garfield actually set the stage first for what Jackie would later do. So James, of course, was shot and lingered for months afterwards. And Crete really set a standard. There's tons of media coverage about what a stoic and brave figure she was, guiding the nation through mourning, the big black veil, all of that. But what I appreciate about Crete is that she was an early forerunner in thinking about presidential libraries. It's not until Franklin Roosevelt that we have the modern presidential library system start in 1941. But Crete Garfield, after her husband was shot, and people realized, we didn't really handle Mary Lincoln that well. We might want to do better this time. They set up a 19th century version of a GoFundMe for her before James even died. And she ended up taking this money and adding on to room in her house, and she collected all of her husband's papers and books and kind of got this concept started. So I just love these lesser known stories about these women and the impact that they had.
Right. Just to follow up on Madison and Dolly Madison, I made my most recent trip out a couple of years ago, and I was so happy to see the historical marker out on the main highway that goes past Montpelier, the various plaques that are about Dolly Madison, and the Humanities Foundation here in Virginia that helped to contribute to that in her memorial there at Montpelier. And I also wanted to mention, if you're looking for a really wonderful book about their marriage, it's called A Perfect Union by Catherine Algor. And she was the head of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And she's just written to me, and Catherine, if you're watching, I haven't answered your email, but welcome to Charlottesville. And if you're in the audience, raise your hand. But her husband's just taken a position at UVA, and so she is joining us in the Charlottesville community. And I hope we'll be able to have her speak to us. Just also thinking about Mamie, if you can't get out to Kansas, and I haven't been there, so I'm coming, Terry, I want to see that. But if you want to go a little bit closer, how many of you have been to Gettysburg to see the retirement home of the Eisenhowers? So I got to do that several years ago and was just bowled over by how you get a sense of Mamie there as well as Ike, and that was the only home they ever owned because, of course, they were in the Army, so they would go from post to post. And yes, the bathroom is pink, which really helped me understand why my mother chose pink tile for our bathroom in Louisville in 1960. And I still have some of the pink towels that she had from that. I want to turn to Heath, because in addition to this book on Mrs. Nixon, Heath has written a really interesting book on the women who were married to prisoners of war during the Vietnam War and how they lobbied to bring those men home. We had one of those men from our church in Louisville, Robert Purcell, I can remember to this day, and every single Mass we would pray for his return, and he did ultimately return to Louisville. I went to school with two of his daughters, and his wife obviously kept the family going. And so I want to ask you, not specifically so much about that book today, but Pat Nixon was a wartime first lady during that very divisive war. And you've mentioned one of the themes of first ladies included in your book is wartime first ladies are often different kinds of first ladies because there's a war underway, whether it's a civil war here in this country or far away in the rice paddies of Southeast Asia. So how did Mrs. Nixon deal with that?
Yes, well, she was a wartime first lady, and a lot of people don't think of her that way, but the Vietnam War had been going on for years. So, of course, there's lots of politics behind that. I do talk a lot about that in League of Wives, my last book. And what was interesting doing Mrs. Nixon's book is the last book, The League of Wives. It was the POW wives looking into the White House, trying so desperately to get in. And now I'm looking at the Vietnam War from Mrs. Nixon's perspective inside the White House, where they're often barricaded in because of the riots that are going on domestically, because of the moratorium on the lawn. So there's a lot of unrest domestically. So she has to maintain her dignity, her composure. Remember, the First Lady is married to the Commander-in-Chief, so she is like the ultimate senior military wife. And her training, speaking of Mamie Eisenhower, comes from Mamie, who is really the military wife of all time, married to the god of all army gods, Dwight Eisenhower. So a lot of Pat's training in this area comes from Mamie. And she maintains that composure domestically when things are a nightmare, when she and the girls can barely leave, when they are worried about the president getting assassinated all the time. Lots of domestic unrest.
And son-in-law David is in the Navy, as I
Yes.
recall, serving his country.
He is serving. He cannot even participate in the White House events at that time because he is off serving his country. But then Mrs. Nixon, and few people know this, is the first Lady to go to an active combat zone. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt had been to a combat zone before, but it was not an active combat zone. Pat knowingly goes to Vietnam with her husband in an open helicopter, flying around. She's meeting with the American servicemen that are wounded in the hospital. She's meeting with the South Vietnamese premier and his wife, president and his wife, and going to the orphanages and doing all of this. This is extremely dangerous. And Pat Nixon took many risks during her life that I thought, as her biographer, I was like, oh my God, why? I don't go, Pat. Like, I would literally talk to her like, do not do this. That being one of them. She could have been killed easily, but she did it as a role model to show people, to give people confidence. H.R. McMaster, who I interviewed for this book about Nixon policies, said, the presence of a First Lady in a combat zone says volumes to the troops, that they are valued, that we care about your sacrifices. So as a wartime First Lady, again, she gets almost no credit for this, but she was an amazing role model and took risk with her own life for our country to show that.
Yeah.
And if I could, just to sort of overlap that with my own experience, I guess I was asked this question another time, and I said I did consider Dr. Biden to be a wartime First Lady for two reasons. One, because of COVID, and you're sort of seen as a national unifier, a national healer, and we tried very much to position her in that role. COVID really, it affected how we campaigned in the middle of that campaign, and then how we would logistically move forward, kind of building the plane as we're flying it in that campaign. But then also it affected the platform that she was going to pursue. We sort of knew what we wanted to do if he had won, but vaccinations became sort of the biggest centerpiece of what we would end up doing, especially in the first 100 days. And then while this wasn't our war, it certainly sometimes felt that way in Ukraine. Jill Biden, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, the First Lady to go into a combat zone of an active war that it was not our war. So our troops weren't there. There was no green zone. And this was the first time a First Lady would be traveling into a combat zone without a green zone, meaning protective zone. There were no U.S. troops on the ground. It took a lot of planning, and it took a lot of, covertness. It was the biggest thing I think that we pulled off logistically. It was working with the State Department, the National Security Council, the regional State Department security, and obviously the Secret Service rolling into Ukraine in an armed convoy. Was going to be a tentative and fluid situation. We have to drop some of our traveling team at the border and only go in a few cars. And I'm used to traveling inside with the press, babysitting them in the motorcade. But in that one, because we were scaling back, I did go in and rode with her in the limo through the streets of the town we were in Ukraine. But it was cut. We were actually going in to bring Mrs. Zelenska, the First Lady of Ukraine, out of hiding. She had not been seen in public because she was the #1 target on Putin's kill list after her husband. So she had not been seen since February, and we decided to do a Mother's Day trip-themed weekend to Eastern Europe, where we would visit with our allies in Romania and Slovakia, who were taking in refugees and families and mothers, and it wasn't public that we were going to go into Ukraine. In fact, I didn't know until 24 hours before, and certainly wasn't told. I knew, I had an idea of why we would be going in there and where we were going, but and the press were very well, once they figured out who was getting out of the other Suburban when we got there. I mean, when the press got out of their car, Jill's there with flowers for Mrs. Zelenska, but all of their attention is on our First Lady not noticing who is getting out to receive the flowers, but eventually it became very obvious. And when Secret Service saw social media activity, sort of like, I think broadcasting our motorcade coming in, I think we spent about 90 minutes there, but shorter than we would have wanted to.
I remember that well. I can remember seeing both women and being so impressed that they were meeting in the midst of this wartime situation.
I remember talking to one of our Secret Service, I think the head of our detail the night before. It was just stressful because we even brought very senior members of the Secret Service who are usually at a desk in Washington with us because there was so much paranoia about this. And that's when he was explaining to me about like not going into a combat zone that wasn't protected, essentially
by our own troops.
It wasn't our war. It wasn't our
right.
troops. Exactly.
Right. And so, can I ask you, Michael, because one thing I want to get from you is the work between the East Wing and the West Wing.
Oh yeah.
Maybe I've hit a nerve.
No.
In a good way. But that's a good example. Does the West Wing come to you and say, we think it would be really good idea if Dr. Biden went to Ukraine and met with Mrs. Zelenska? Or does the East Wing say, what would be great would be to have the First Lady go to Ukraine?
Both. The answer is yes.
Okay.
Both.
Okay.
So the way we operated, and I think you'll probably read a lot about this, the power centers between the West Wing and the East Wing. You'll read a little bit about this in the book Original Sin, I believe, because they want to talk about, or they want to discuss in the book about Jill Biden's role. But we were what we would call integrated into the West Wing in ways that were probably not typical. Jill's chief of staff had a role at the table, or a seat at the table, I should say. So in that case, in other words, she had a seat at every table because her interests were represented on the campaign and into the White House. But it was not so much about pursuing her own agenda. She wasn't really interested in being an advocate. The only advocate she had ever really been for was her husband. And so we were integrated with the West Wing because we would go on the road and stump for his goals, his legislative agenda. Certainly the first thing on our plate was making sure that the rescue plan was pushed through. And we went on the road to sort of campaign for the rescue plan. And then, as I was saying earlier, we were integrated into the sort of COVID vaccination plan for the country, which was coming out for different age groups every couple of months or so, and we would sort of take the lead on sort of the education process and visiting vaccination centers in red states, blue states. She became sort of the lead on that, but there were times when the DPC, the Domestic Policy Council, would come to us and say it would really be helpful if Dr. B could go to Iowa and stand with the member of Congress there because we want to educate the public about early child care and Build Back Better, for example. With Ukraine, it was more, I think it was more us pushing. The war affected her. The war was affecting her. She was watching the news the way everybody was and was affected and felt passionately that we needed to help the Ukrainians. And I remember we were on the plane, her plane, coming back from an event very early in the war. And the great thing about working for the First Lady is that on our plane, we could all get into our Lululemon clothes afterwards and our sweatpants and have a glass of wine. Where you can't really do that with the president on his plane. First of all, he didn't drink. Second of all, you had to sort of, even if we're traveling overnight to a country abroad, it was wearing a suit and tie. But
Did you have to sleep in your suit and tie?
She was a cool boss. No, we did not.
Maybe you didn't sleep.
Didn't sleep, but also they didn't have the pods the way they do in business. It's actually not as comfortable as you think. But, not complaining. It was wonderful. But she's like, well, should we go to Ukraine? This is like very early in the war, and I said, well, like, what would be our purpose? Like, what could we do to be helpful there? How can we help the president there? And actually, they were about to send us, I think, if I recall correctly, maybe it was for the Munich Security Conference, and the vice president, we knew our order in the pecking line. And there's always, people like to make a big deal about that stuff, but the fact that the vice president wanted to go, it was like, yes, she should go, and she went. But Dr. Biden's chief of staff, Anthony Bernal, was a very creative guy who knew how to build events and build trips and sort of get the most value out of Dr. B for her husband. And it was set up as basically a campaign surrogate operation, is what I like to describe. They don't like that, but I like to say that was what our East Wing was. It was continuation of the campaign, but campaigning for his vision, his goals, his objectives, and his accomplishments.
So you can see why many of you know about our oral history program here at the Miller Center. And Michael's question as we were walking into the room was, when did that start? Well, I'm wearing my 50th anniversary button for the Miller Center this year, celebrating its 50th anniversary. One of the first projects it undertook was that picture that you see, and you come up the top of the stairs here, and that is the Ford administration had just gone out of office, and then the next administration was Jimmy Carter, and on we go, and we will be starting a Biden project very soon. I was telling Michael he'll be on our list. You can see why. Because it's these kinds of stories that don't end up in the press, that may not end up in the press accounts written by journalists that are now coming.
Which is why I'm getting a lot of angry messages as we speak, because I'm sure my former colleagues aren't too happy and are watching.
I am sure. But that this will be the next draft of these stories that we will be picking up for those who served in the Biden administration, East Wing, West Wing, cabinet positions, et cetera. We're getting some questions from you here in person and also online. And so one of them I want to put to Terry is about Eleanor Roosevelt. And they're connecting that to Jill Biden being, as Michael said, her own person, staying with her job. But we've also been talking about whether first ladies were advocates for a certain project as we've come to understand them, certainly in the modern era. So do you want to speak about Eleanor Roosevelt particularly, and maybe combine her with Hillary Clinton as two of the most influential modern first ladies, and how they were their own people, but also accomplished what they wanted to accomplish for their own agendas in some instances?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me from a journalism perspective how Eleanor Roosevelt was really the first like multimedia journalist, because she was on the radio, she was writing a newspaper column.
Press conferences.
Well,
Yeah,
right,
press
and then
conferences.
yes, opening the door so women reporters had an opportunity during the Great Depression so they wouldn't be fired. Just amazing work from the media perspective. More broadly, of course, she had tremendous influence as far as human rights and civil rights, advocating for the poor. The amount of travel, when we talk about first ladies and wartime, right? Her traveling to boost the morale of troops. She truly was a powerhouse, and we think of her very fondly now, rightfully so, but she faced a lot of criticism for that, obviously. I mean, she was taking, before when I talk about Sarah Polk, it was largely hidden how influential she was, and she did that on purpose. She, when she talked to people, she'd say, well, Mr. Polk believes, even though she was also speaking for herself. When we talk about Edith Wilson, there was rumblings at the time of how much control she actually had, but it's been, I think, more of a modern day discussion about how much power she actually did have during that time. So for Eleanor, this was really making a huge crack in the mold that a first lady was being this visible. And certainly right after her, you have first ladies like Mamie and Bess Truman kind of take a step back. But Eleanor really did open the door for Dr. Biden to want to keep her own job and first ladies to have more power over how they were going to set their direction.
Right. We have some questions again from our audience. One is, what kinds of budgets do first ladies have in the East Wing to run their shop? Particularly since it's not a constitutional position, it's not a statutory position. Did you get into that at all, Heath, about the staff of Pat Nixon? And by the way, my colleague Mark Silverstone is here, who heads up our Presidential Studies Unit. He and my colleague Ian McKee are the series editors of our Presidential Studies series with the UVA Press. And we have a book that will be coming out within the next year or so by Elizabeth Reese, who is really studying from a scholarly perspective the staffs of First Ladies. And that is usually said to begin with officially Rosalind Carter. Yes. But in Mrs. Nixon's case, if we can back up a little bit, how did she assemble a staff? Did she have any money to do that? And most recently, Michael, what about budgets for the East Wing? So I'll start with Heath.
I can tell by the look on Michael's face, we're all underfunded. So, the East Wing, I mean, to go, and first Elizabeth, who I have had a lot of correspondence with and is an amazing scholar. I'm really looking forward to reading more of her work. And I know there's an Iranian journalist working on a book about the East Wing.
That's right.
Azadeh Moveni, who's lovely also. So yes, Rosalind Carter is when this is an official thing with a budget. I believe it's 1978, if I'm not incorrect. So Pat Nixon, in my book, and I have a whole chapter, East Wing versus West Wing, Battle of the Sexes, which was my favorite chapter to write. But in that, there is a battle because it was really seen as lesser than. The First Lady's side of the house was not getting, there was hardly any budget. There were not enough staff. That was very typical for before also, of course, to go back to even Jackie Kennedy, Lady Bird, and then it starts getting better. So when Pat Nixon is there, I call it's still pioneer days for the East Wing. And for example, Ehrlichman and Haldeman in the West Wing, they tried to take over the East Wing and put it under the West Wing for correspondence, for various other things. They tried to give Pat a male chief of staff, and she says, Dick, I will not have a male chief of staff. So there's the soft power, behind the scenes, and shuts that down immediately. So I think she is a kind of a modern First Lady in that she begins to shape the East Wing into what it becomes when Rosalind Carter officially makes it, waves the magic wand and makes it an official thing with a real budget. Mm-hmm. So we're kind of on the way to that, but she is always fending off power grabs from the West Wing, attempted coup, of her responsibilities, and Pat is very particular, this is not going to happen, and she pushes back. And so you can read more about that in the book, but it is worthy of its own novel and what was happening there. But I'm a historian, so I don't do
Fiction
novels.
writers take
Fiction
notice,
writers
take notice.
go for it.
Yes. Now,
Okay.
budgets, most recently in the office of the First Lady, Michael.
Well, I think they, without understanding the numbers, I can just tell you like the experience of going through it. But so the First Lady staff has obviously grown and expanded. There's a policy shop and a communications, scheduling in advance, chief of staff's office. And then, but there's still power grabs. There's still land grabs, as they would say. Because all First Ladies use the East Wing very differently. In the East Wing, on the first floor, is actually the Office of Legislative Affairs. And the Visitor's Office. Apologies, there's 2 offices. On the first floor of the East Wing, upstairs is the First Lady's offices, suite of offices, and then there's the calligrapher's offices, and the military office is upstairs. And the military office is extremely important because they are responsible for coordinating all of the domestic and international travel, our planes, and everything that's on the planes and the manifests, and we all work together. We work with them, they work with Secret Service. It's all like a loop. But there's a lot that takes place, including a SCIF. So when we would have
Tell us what a SCIF stands for.
I forget.
Oh, Secure
It's just the place
Conference.
It's just the place you have to give up your phones.
Institutional
Yeah.
Network or something.
It's the place where you have
It's
to-
not a boat. It's
Right.
not a SCIF,
No,
but it's
like
a secure.
You take off your watch and your
Yeah,
phones and
yeah.
leave them behind and go in, and similar to the Situation Room. So when there were foreign trips that we would have to work with our advanced teams or our Secret Service already in position, or the planners, or our bilaterally the foreign government, we would talk to them in a SCIF. So there's a lot in the East Wing. But as my chief of staff would tell you, I mean, there were some land grabs during Melania 1.0, and she gave up a lot of the space. She turned Mrs. Obama's East Wing. There was sort of less staff, and she depended on a lot of what you call detailees from other agencies. So those detailees were in the best spots because they could have an agency salary, which are better than White House salaries, and just be on detail to the White House to help the First Lady's office. But
Did she pick those, Michael, or were they chosen for her by the agencies and sent to the White House?
probably, I imagine from what I know, the way that Mrs. Trump set up her first office, I don't know about this one. She had a few staff that she hand selected. And then as they went along to sort of figure out their needs, they grabbed from other agencies for help in specific areas, like a policy person maybe from another agency, or a communications person from another agency.
Okay.
That they could be utility players, and we did that too. Not OFL, not the First Lady's office, but the President's office did a lot. Pulled in people from other agencies. We did it for advanced work as well. A lot of advanced staff come from other agencies,
Right.
so we can repurpose people and for big trips or not. But the big thing now is actually like, while the staff has grown, the budget has grown. OFL is a division within the Executive Office of the President, along with like National Security Council, Economic Council, things like that. It's part of the EOP, as you call it. But the more senior you are in each division of the EOP, you have your title, and then there is a chance to be a commissioned officer, which is the most senior is, let's say, White House Chief of Staff and Assistant to the President. For example, and then there's the next tier of commissioned officers are Deputy Assistants to the President, plus their title. Mine was Special Assistant to the President and Press Secretary to the First Lady, and I was the first commissioned press secretary in an OFL. There's been communications directors who have been commissioned, but everybody gets to set their seniority style however they want it.
Right, right.
So there was a time when the Chief of Staff to the First Lady wasn't anything. And then they became an assistant to the president or deputy assistant to the president. Changes depending on the first lady.
Right. So this will be one of our last questions I want to pose to Terry, and you mentioned soft power. And I will just say, first of all, I was really sad to read that a fellow political scientist called Joseph Nye at Harvard passed away a week or two ago. And he is credited with developing the distinction in political science between soft power and hard power. Not that he necessarily applied his concept of soft power, which is outside the realm of, let's say, military or economic sanctions, but things like diplomatic trips of the First Lady or artistic exchanges or things like the Fulbright program, as an example. I actually was castigated at a panel at a presidential site summit by two female colleagues, historians, who were upset that I was using the term soft power as applied to first ladies. And they said, oh no, that denigrates the power that, oh good, Terry is not going to castigate me here on stage or
we
on
used it
recording.
intentionally. We used the phrase intentionally.
Oh, excellent.
Still very relevant.
Thank you. So Terry, historically, tell us about that concept and how you can apply it to first ladies.
Oh, well, I mean, going back to Dolly Madison, right? What we were talking about at the beginning, and how Madison himself said that Dolly gets more done doing her role than I do mine. How important that relationship building is in creating a good culture where, I mean, you know, we talked about today putting enemies next to each other at a dinner so they're forced to talk and work it out. I mean, going to Pat Nixon, I mean, let's talk about the pandas, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's a great
really
example.
soft power.
Yeah, right? I mean, the
Huge.
pandas today that so many people enjoy at the zoo is thanks to Pat Nixon.
Ping pong diplomacy, right?
Yes.
Between the Chinese and the Americans.
Right?
Yeah.
When you think about Michelle Obama and the garden and trying to encourage healthy eating throughout the country, these different causes that these women pick up, this is why I mentioned that they're influencers, right? Because with the projects that they pick to focus on, they are exerting power, even if it is dancing on Ellen, right? It's showing that the office of the First Lady is accessible and normal and caring about the public, which is something that in difficult times we really need. I mean, when you talk about the First Lady in COVID, right?
Yeah.
Needing leaders we can look up to. And so, going back to the beginning when we were talking about why studying First Ladies is important, I study First Ladies because I was trying to figure out what I wanted to research, and I had a male professor tell me that studying First Ladies was trivial.
Wow.
And that was a decade ago, and that comment still really sticks with me because to me, that comment is not only trivializing First Ladies, but women's contributions to history as a whole. And yes, we may be exerting soft power, but it's just as important to study and to recognize as hard power.
And indeed, when we haven't mentioned Hillary Clinton very much,
Yes,
but the Miller
yes.
Center was asked by Hillary Clinton and her team to start an oral history of her as First Lady, prior to being First Lady, going into the Senate, and then obviously running for president, and then ending up as Secretary of State. And so talk about a First Lady, both during her First Ladyship and after, and probably before as well, was exerting hard power. And yet the American people do have an interesting way, understandably, since as we started by saying this is not a constitutional office, it's not a statutory office, and therefore it is viewed quite correctly as being unaccountable to the American people. So the American people's antenna tends to go up if a First Lady is viewed as getting out of that lane of maybe more soft power, and Michael is saying, yes, that is true, and being viewed as trying to engage in hard power or formalized power. And yet, I'll just end with we've got a couple of questions about our current First Lady, and yet if a First Lady is not present enough and not being viewed by the American people or journalists as doing enough, she will get controversy coming towards her and she will get criticism for that. So I have no criticism for our panel or our audience today. Thank you so much for, first of all, your attention and your questions, and for those online as well. If you want to watch this again or send it along, it will be online very soon. And we also want to thank our staff here at the Miller Center, Christina Lopez Guittardi Chow, my colleague and professor in presidential studies, who puts all these together. Alfred Reeves IV, also my colleague who works on this. And Mike, as you know, we couldn't get these up online. We couldn't record them without Stace and Dan and Sean to take photos that we can have for history. So given that this is our last meeting until we begin our fall semester, please, if you'll give all those folks a hand as well as our panel.